on behalf of the National Career Development Association. We are pleased that you have all joined us today. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and share some technical information for you. During the webinar, all of the attendees' microphone will be muted. We encourage any questions that you have for our presenters to be typed into the Q&A section, which can be found on the lower section of your screen. Our presenters will address those questions as we go through the webinar or at the end of the webinar. Individuals who have signed up and paid for the webinar can log into their account on the NCDA website to view their continuing education certificates beginning next week. Groups that are attending will need to return their sign-in sheet to me in order to receive their certificates. This program is approved for 1 contact hour of continuing education and was also offered for free if you are not interested in the continuing education. For any questions on continuing education, you can contact me, Alicia Cheek, at NCDA headquarters. My contact information was included in your webinar instructions message. Our presenters today are members of the NCDA Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We now present DEI and Career Development. How are we incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into career services during COVID-19?
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to the National Career there was, I think, okay. Is somebody driving? Okay, all right, so, thank you so much, everybody. I am so pleased and honored to be here with a group of exceptional colleagues. And before we get started into our panel presentation today, I really want to start with some specific information about each of our colleagues here today on this panel. I will also start out with explaining where this panel came from, the context for it, and certainly where we're going with the direction of our panel presentation today. So with that being said, my name is Dr. Christian Chan. I am an assistant professor with the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I am co-chair of the National Career Development Association Committee on Diversity Initiatives and Cultural Inclusion. And my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm also the president-elect of the Association for Adult Development and Aging and a proud queer person of color. So, for me as a scholar activist, my interests firmly revolve around intersectionality, multiculturalism and counseling practice, supervision and counselor education, social justice, and activism, career development, critical research methodologies. And so, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce each of our panelists here today with us. So we have Mako Miller, who is the Career Services Manager for Kauffman Scholars, Incorporated. Mako Miller is a champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in Kansas City. For over 14 years, Mako has made a commitment to higher education through her work for both 2- and 4-year colleges. So currently, Mako is a career services manager for Kauffman Scholars, where she strives to remove barriers for career and social capital for students in the program. Additionally, she is pursuing her EDD, her Doctor of Education at the University of Kansas in Higher Education Administration, in hopes of serving in a role that promotes and supports DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in post-secondary education. We also have Dr. David Julius Ford Jr. with us today. Dr. Ford holds a BA in psychology and a MA in clinical mental health counseling, both from Wake Forest University. In May 2014, he earned his PhD in counselor education and supervision at Old Dominion University. Dr. Ford is a licensed clinical mental health counselor in North Carolina and a licensed professional counselor in Virginia and New Jersey. He's a national certified counselor and approved clinical supervisor. Dr. Ford taught for 4 years at James Madison University and is now an assistant professor in the Department of Professional Counseling at Monmouth University and serves as the president-elect of the New Jersey Counseling Association. Dr. Ford's professional interests are Black Greek life, multicultural issues, college students, African American men in higher education, career counseling, addictions counseling, supervision, group work, qualitative research, the LGBTQIA community, intersectionality, and persons living with HIV/AIDS. We also have Emily Q. Frank with us, who is the founder and owner of Career Catalyst. Emily has more than 14 years of career counseling experience in higher education and private practice. She specializes in helping quirky, creative people and those with international experience reinvent their career paths. She has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies from Smith College and a master's degree in counseling. She calls Denver home, but works with people from around the world, and she has co-presented at NCDA on creating trans-friendly counseling spaces. And we also have Dr. Cheryl Love with us, who serves as a career counselor and liaison to the College of Education and Integrative Studies and the Bronco Dreamers Resource Center at Cal Poly Pomona. She's the coordinator of the Clothes Closet Service for the Career Center and is adjunct faculty for the Educational Leadership Department at Cal Poly Pomona. Dr. Love has 30 plus years of experience as a counselor and teacher in all 4 higher education systems in California. So that includes the University of California system, the Cal State University system, private and community colleges, as well as the public school and nonprofit sectors. This breadth of experience has provided her with the knowledge and skills to work with diverse student populations to assist them with identifying their career goals. She has a master's degree in counseling with a people personnel service credential from California State University, Fullerton, and a doctorate from the University of California, Los Angeles in educational psychology with an emphasis in counseling. And Dr. Cheryl Love is also co-chair of the NCDA Committee on Diversity Initiatives and Cultural Inclusion with me. So again, extremely honored to have our esteemed panelists here with us today. And just to, before we jump into some of our questions and our discussion here, I did want to introduce tone, right? The tone of why we're doing this and why it's so critical and necessary to this particular time as we think about the racial climate that we're living in, as we think about the climate that we're living in with COVID-19. So the first piece I wanted to highlight is that, I think this is, so I certainly worked with, especially with Mako and Dr. Love on creating a panel that really, focuses on, especially with speaking about these issues and not sugarcoating it, right? So, I'm not in the business of sugarcoating these issues. And in many ways, we need to speak transparently and authentically about them. So this is not a panel where we're going to be holding back. So I just got to put that out there. And the other piece too is that we also, I know that we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as an amalgamation of these topics. And I think especially in light of what's been happening in the world today and in our conversations, the panel and I have discussed that, we're going to be focusing a lot on equity. And I think in many ways, equity in the ways that it shows up, because we're not just moving into just having diverse worldviews and perspectives, but really about recognizing how these structures have been rooted in centuries, in foundations that have created some multiple overlapping forms of oppression. The other piece here is, important to these conversations. A critical conversation that we're having today is, for me, as I shared earlier, I'm not in the business of sugarcoating these issues. So we have to name and denounce anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racial violence in all its forms, recognizing the fact that so much of what we're doing, what we see, right? I think sometimes we sort of create this distance in our work in career services and in career practices, right? Or career development, that we create this distance between us as to whether we should be broaching these issues and whether we shouldn't. And assuming that we don't need to, and that unless our clients or our students bring it up, but it's absolutely critical. in broaching these issues. So we must name and denounce all of these forces that are culminating in our world today. And in many ways, I wanted to identify that, you know, in so many ways, part of the first piece of anti-racist work that we're also addressing as a part of our conversation today also takes place first with us, right? It takes place with us, and it recognizes the ways that we are also responsible and answerable to these particular addressing these forces, but also at the same time making sure that we are figuring out how we have embodied white supremacy, anti-Blackness in our own, not only in our own work, but in ourselves. And I think that's so much of where we're going today in terms of our conversation. So as you can tell, it's merging a lot of our personal and professional work together. So just to kick off our conversation here today with our panel, I'm going to start with this first question. So in your respective work setting, how have you witnessed COVID-19 impact specific social identities? For example, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity, ability status, spirituality in terms of career development or the workplace? And I'll go ahead and start with Mako.
Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're streaming in from. But thank you, Christian, for laying that foundation and that framework for us this morning. And I'm really excited to be amongst people I consider, you know, peers and colleagues in this work. And so this question, I think, is a really great place to start to kind of give us an overall picture of what's happening with COVID-19 and then layering on those pieces with identity. And so just in the research I've done in the last few months, you know, COVID-19, it brings unprecedented threats to the individuals and communities that we've been serving, as the most vulnerable often have the least access to the information and resources. And so some of the employment sectors most affected by the social distancing protocols set in place here in the US are in restaurants and bars, the travel industry, transportation, entertainment, personal services, certain types of retail and manufacturing. And these are the sectors that employ a high percentage of women, African American, Latinx, and Native American employees. And I use the term BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, which is something I personally identify as a mixed race individual. I consider myself in that BIPOC identification. And so this results, in a disproportionate number of employees of color and women being displaced from their jobs during this pandemic. And so considering that BIPOC people are underrepresented in quote unquote professional occupations, they may be, and I don't want to say they may be, they are experiencing the adverse economic consequences of COVID-19 at an increased intensity when compared to their white upper middle class counterparts. So, we need to really understand and research and fully explore those economic and psychological consequences of workers of color in the US during this pandemic. And it's, I love that this is something hosted by a career counseling association, because that psychological piece plays a huge part, because trauma has happened during this pandemic, especially with our BIPOC community. And so, they've already experiencing discrimination and limited access to opportunities and resources. So as practitioners, I think, we need to be asking ourselves, how are structural barriers impeding workers of color and accessing employment during COVID-19? How can you help navigate that for your clients and the students that you're working with? What are the short-term and long-term economic, vocational, and psychological consequences for these communities, particular in regards to access to just basic needs and survival when work opportunities are disproportionately limited. And so communities of color have higher unemployment rates than white communities, We already know this. And so will these differential rates be further perpetuated by COVID-19? The answer is yes, because it's already happening, and it's going to result in these greater economic disparities. So again, just doing the research and understanding that as you are working and supporting your clients and your students in this work in career development is, I think, something really important to consider as we are in this space.
And I would add that when you're developing, and this is for the career service personnel that's on the call, you need to acknowledge that, because I think a lot of times it's like, okay, we're just going to do that interviewing workshop, and we're going to create opportunities for people to practice interviewing with us or getting help with job searching. But first and foremost, you need to acknowledge the very things that Mako was talking about, and then think about what you're going to do within your organization to provide resources to address these things. Because I think oftentimes it's like that, oh yeah, there's all these things happening in the world, but that doesn't really have anything to do with us. We're just about helping people get their resume to look right and getting them ready for an interview. And I think that we need to think differently. And it starts with, we have to acknowledge that there's trauma. We have to acknowledge, and I don't think we've always done a good job of this, we have to acknowledge that for certain of the clients that we serve, specifically clients of color, that the playing field is not level, and that we have to do a better job of providing them with tools to navigate the institutions that are inherently racist. And so that's on us. And I think that if you don't leave this webinar with any other message today, you should be doing some very serious self-reflection about what can I do to interact with the people that I'm supposed to serve differently, because business as usual and ignoring the fact that many of your clients are dealing with a high degree of trauma and ongoing oppression that really impacts on their career development. And so how you provide services to them needs to look different.
And I'll add to that. Thank you both for preaching good sermons. That's some good word right there. We can pass the offering plate and say the benediction.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. And my experience working in academia is that those of us that are able to live at work instead of work at home can keep our salaries and keep getting paid. But what I've seen, not only at my university, but at other universities from colleagues of mine, is that those persons that work at student affairs, your grounds folks, your maintenance folks, housekeeping, food service, which tend to be mostly Black and brown folks, yes, aren't able to work. And they get lost in the fray of a university still trying to stay afloat. So if university needs to make budget cuts, they're the first ones to get cut. They're furloughed, and God forbid if they're not unionized, so they don't really get a salary, and unemployment has been backed up, so they may not be making any money. And so those of us that have the privilege on a college campus need to start fighting for and with those that may not be able to work during this pandemic. We need to make sure that the university has provisions in place for those employees that aren't working. And most often, universities tend to use a company for their food service. then they need to put pressure, like if you use Aramark, whatever, they need to put pressure on them to make sure those food service workers still have a way to make money, because they are being impacted disproportionately by the pandemic and colleges not being open.
And I'll add that for those of us in private practice, we also need to be really aware of these issues, because our clients are absolutely facing this, and they're struggling with all of these challenges going on in the world. And our settings are different. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us in private practice to make sure that we are being very overt in our welcoming messages to people who are traditionally marginalized. And so that means making sure that any images on your website aren't exclusively straight-looking cis white people who are 25. And it's hard, you know, I went through that with my website. It's hard to find those, but you find the images and you list your pronouns, and you put in things like, you know, some social justice issues that are really important, so that people who are looking for help in private practice spaces can find that information and see it and know that you are going to be someone who champions them and someone who is comfortable having those discussions. I think sometimes our clients are hesitant to bring it up, particularly if, like me, you look white. And I want it to be really, really clear to my clients that we can have that discussion. And I will absolutely honor where you're coming from and do everything in my power to support you as you go through the process.
Thank you, panelists. So I'm going to jump to our second question here, but given histories surrounding anti-Blackness, racial violence, and white supremacy, how can career practitioners address career development in light of these forces while COVID-19 is taking place, essentially in a double pandemic? Dr. Ford, I'm wondering if you could start us out with this conversation. Oh, Dr. Ford, I think you're muted.
Okay, wow. The one thing is, like I said before, is those of us that hold different levels of economic privilege can also fight for those that don't have the same economic privilege. And we also have to acknowledge that these systems are inherently anti-Black and anti-Brown. We can't skirt around that issue. We can't, just brush over that. Most of our economic systems favor whiteness, and they're heteronormative, and there are no protections in place for folks that look like you and me. And so we have to, those of us that are on the other side, quote unquote, because academia is still white. Hell, ACA is white. So we have to be the ones that can levy our privilege for those of us that look like us that are still being economically disadvantaged. That means our career services have to be Black and brown as fuck. They have to take into account our clientele and be culturally inclusive and really advocate for our clients in those spaces that don't want them to be there in the first place. So we can't just have this clear approach to career counseling when working with Black and brown folks who have been disadvantaged. That's not fair to them, and we're not providing good services. So we have to take into account, especially those of us that are white, that are white professionals, have to really be intentional about bringing that race and ethnicity component into the career room, and let that also tailor their interventions, because if not, do that person disservice.
Yeah, I'll add that I think what Dr. Love said earlier about, you check yourself, the famous line, check yourself before you wreck yourself, own your privilege and decide how you can use that privilege to leverage opportunities for others who are marginalized. This whole controversy surrounding race conscious policies, they need to be race conscious policies, not race neutral policies. I mean, you look at this country, we use race conscious policies to create barriers to access and equitable opportunities. Therefore, we need to be consciously thinking about race to be sure that BIPOC people are included in the framework of these new policies and the procedures that you're utilizing in terms of delivering your career services. And so, you have to go back to the drawing board and think about how does this system or this structure that we do create a barrier? And so just remember that, the opposite of non-racist, or the opposite of racist is not non-racist, it's anti-racist. And so that means taking action and actually doing the work to create those anti-racist systems.
And I'm glad, Mako, that you said do the work, because part of why we're still stuck in, I was going to say dark ages, we got to go past that. Part of the reason why we haven't evolved and why we still have institutions that are racist and seem almost incapable of change is because people are not willing to do the work. I will tell you, in the last couple of months, I've seen so many statements that different organizations and even on my campus have made. I stand in solidarity with Black people. That's nice. That was a nice statement that you made. Now, what are you going to do? See, statements are meaningless if you're not going to back up the statement with some action. And so part of what the problem is, and this is my call to everyone that's on the call, is that after you've done the self-reflection, after you have owned your privilege, now leverage that privilege and help those who have been marginalized and continue to be oppressed in a society that is extremely racist, and anti-Blackness is real. That's another thing. Oftentimes I hear people, what are you talking about? I don't have a problem with Black people. I don't understand this anti-Blackness thing. And so I'm not even acknowledging that it's a real thing. And so to me, you need to move beyond lip service into action. So that requires work on your part. And I think for many, it's hard to do the work. They may feel sad about some of the things that are happening in the world, and they feel, really comfortable in working with clients who continuously struggle because of the systems that are in place to oppress them. But if we're going to have lasting change, you have to be willing to do the work. And it's not easy work. And it's ongoing. So you don't just attend a webinar and, hey, now I'm woke, and so I don't have anything else I need to do. You have to continuously work to improve our society, or we're going to stay back in past the dark ages. So.
And this is going to be uncomfortable work for a lot of white practitioners. And that's okay, right? Like, it's time for us to be uncomfortable. Our colleagues of color have been dying, right? A little discomfort on our part is a tiny price to pay. We have to step into the places where we feel some of that discomfort, where we feel like, oh my gosh, I really should have been doing something about this. I'm late to this party. We need to really step into those spaces and own it. And we'll talk more about privilege in a bit, but I just wanted to offer the very quick definition here. We're talking a lot about privilege early on, and here's the thing. Privilege doesn't mean your life is easy. Privilege doesn't mean like everything has been handed to you since the day you were born. Privilege, and in this particular case, white privilege, means that your life is not made more complicated because of the color of your skin. And just really own that and step into that, because it's something that we can use for the greater good.
Amen.
Speak on it, Emily. Speak on it.
Yes. Reach.
So,
Yes.
oh, Dr. Love, did you?
Oh yeah, I wanted just to say one more thing. I wanted to stay on that. You need to, accept that you're going to be a little bit uncomfortable. In fact, I'm working with students this summer who are, future leaders. And one of the things, and they're learning to lead from a social justice lens. And one of the things I say to them from the beginning, middle, and end, you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Until you can get there, you're going to have a problem. And that's where real change occurs. You need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because this work is hard, but it's necessary.
And white fragility can't get in the way.
Amen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think because we are on this topic right now, I'm wondering for our panel, if they're, sorry, somebody called me in the middle of this. How do you leverage your privilege to address the double pandemic of white supremacy and COVID-19 in career services? And I'm wondering if, Emily, if you could prompt us a little bit in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important topic. The first thing I think we really need to own is that some of us are going to look white, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with our own self-image. I see myself very much as an Asian person, but I'm really aware, hyper aware, that people who see me assume that I'm a white person. And what I can do with that is really use that voice and that privilege to move the needle forward. It's been 400 years of people in the US treating people of color badly, more than 400 years. And we need to own that. And it doesn't mean that, I'm personally responsible for slavery, but it does mean that I am personally responsible for breaking systems that keep people trodden down, and it's not okay. And so we really speak into that, and we really have to add our voices to this conversation. People of color in the US have been telling us this whole time how they want to be treated. Spoiler alert, it's as fully human. There's nothing complicated about this. And we have to really recognize that when our colleagues and clients of color tell us about these experiences, it's not our place to say things like, are you really sure that's what happened? Or, I'm sure he didn't mean it that way. Those kinds of conversations keep disempowering people. And we also need to acknowledge that there are systems in place that continue to keep the scales unbalanced, to keep people from buying homes, from getting the education that they want and deserve. That pay inequity is still an issue. And I think career services is fundamentally a social justice field if we step into it. And so we do really have to embrace that discomfort. And I think everyone has to embrace it to some extent, but especially white practitioners need to really own this and speak through it and really honor what people are telling us. This is just a kind of a crazy story. So years ago, I worked with someone who has since retired, who had an Asian student come into her office. It was a second generation student. And the student was talking through her career process. And this particular practitioner, it just makes me scream even to think about it. She stood up at one point and walked to her office door and opened the door. And she said, I want you to take your family out of the room. And then she shut the door and she's delighted. Thought this was like that most fabulous intervention in the entire universe. And when she told that story about how great it was, like 4,000 years of my ancestors screamed. So we can't assume that whiteness is normal, that this is kind of the professional way to be, that everyone is on the same page. And when our students tell us things, we address it. When our colleagues, when our clients tell us things, we step into it and move forward with it. And then we use our voices, particularly those of us who look white, to make the world a better place. We vote, we write to our senators, we march with people, and we make our specific practices fair and welcoming. and all of the wonderful pieces that we have the opportunity to do right now. And I'd love to hear everyone else too.
We have to be willing to call out those microaggressions, and I'm so glad you talked about that. You know, are you sure that that's what they meant, or I don't think they meant it that way, or you know, just minimizing their experience, that's a microaggression. And we have to, on one side, be able to call them out, and if we are the person who microaggressed someone, be able to not get defensive and say, acknowledge the fact that, hey, yeah, that was pretty fucked up what I just said, you know. And so we have to both have courage, the courage to call it out, and the courage to accept the fact that I, you know, messed up, and then the courage to have that discussion, and the courage to change. That's why I don't believe in safe spaces. I only believe in brave spaces. That means you have the courage to be uncomfortable, the courage to be challenged, and the courage to change, and the courage to grow. And so, you know, for me, I say at almost 45 years old, you know, I have no qualms about calling it out. But my thing is, if you are truly someone who is going to be anti-racist, you have to sit with that and say, you know what? Yeah, let me think about that and sit with the discomfort of me being called out and do my best to not let that happen again. So those of us that are in privilege, that have the privilege, have to be willing to kind of fight the good fight for those that don't.
And know what your implicit biases are, right? We all have them. Right. There's loads of free tests that you can take that help you figure out your implicit biases, and take them and own it, right? This doesn't make you a bad person. This makes you a person who's grown up in a society that is racist. And so you've gotten those messages, and you have to kind of address them when you see them. The last time I took an implicit bias test, was really uncomfortable for me. It showed that I associate Native Americans and foreign, and which is ridiculous, of course, and I know that logically, but it's the message that I have been given. And once I could see that that was something that was going on deep in my brain, not in my conscious brain, I could take steps to address it. And you can't just get stuck in feeling bad or guilty or weird or uncomfortable with it. You go, oh, crap, I guess I do feel that way. I better work on that. But you can't understand your own biases, or you can't work on your own biases until you name them and really address them.
Right.
And it really does take courage. But in order for us to really have change that's sustainable, we're going to need a lot of folks to be courageous. And I love what Dr. Ford had mentioned earlier. We can't let white fragility get in the way. It's going to take that. And it's also going to take people acknowledging that the anti-Blackness is real. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in my lifetime, not just recently, having to try to explain that. It is a real thing. And oh, by the way, it's not just happening by white folks, because that's one of the things that I often hear, you know, is white people that are anti-Black and, you know, showing in their behavior, words and deeds. No, anti-Blackness is real, and there's many that are participating in it. And white supremacy is a real thing too. And there is such a thing as racial violence. And so Dr. Chen set the stage at the very beginning, and I'm bringing it back in order to really deal with our privilege and address it in a way so that we can really serve all of our clients, not just some, in career services. We need to be courageous, acknowledge our privilege, acknowledge that anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racial violence is the thing that is holding us all down. And to get past it, everyone is going to need to be courageous and need to call out when microaggressions are occurring and not be defensive if you're the one doing the microaggressions, and be willing to do the work. It's back to what I was saying earlier, being willing to do the work so that you can change, so that there can be change.
So, Mako, did you have anything that you wanted to share? If not, I had something I wanted to also contribute.
Yeah, no, in the spirit of time too, I loved what everybody contributed, but yeah, just, you know, in terms of privilege, I understand my privilege. I understand my my ambiguity in the way I look, and that people are not so, like, they're kind of confused, like, is she Hawaiian? Is she Samoan? Is she Black? You know, so I own that privilege and utilize that, and where I work, because I work for a foundation that is very well known here in Kansas City, and utilizing that to create those connections and those spaces for the students in our program that primarily identify as Black and Latinx. And so I make sure to be conscious of that in how I am creating opportunities and connections, and hoping to build that cultural, social, and career capital for our students. That's always front of mind for me, is how can I leverage my positionality and the way I look and come into white spaces, because I know that the way I look, I think, is a little more inviting for some white folks, just to be honest. And I understand that. And I also understand my proximity to whiteness as well, because my partner is white. And so I also leverage that as well. So that's definitely something that I think of in terms of how I can leverage my privilege.
Absolutely, absolutely. I appreciate the responses from each of the panelists to this question, and in ways that we're also speaking about privilege as not just something that we're all encountering external to us, but something that we're continuously, iteratively reflecting on as a part of our own practices. I think in many ways, just to summarize some of these points from the panelists, I think part of what happens with privilege, right, is that we also play this kind of emotional resistance. It manifests in this way, where we essentially create this psychological distance between ourselves, because we assume that we're now because I can't be privileged because that's, you know, or I can't be racist or heterosexist or trans prejudice based on my because that's not who I am, that's not my values, that's not but I could never be, right? It's because people attach that to who they are rather than understanding what are the effects of your actions, right? Or inaction. And I think that's what we need to also make sure we're understanding, like that racism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, that all of these different forces are not just contingent on our personhood or who we are in our identity, but perhaps it's more contingent on the actions that, or lack of action, that we take. And so I think in many ways, I certainly wanted to highlight that from the panelists in terms of responses to this question. The other piece I wanted to throw out to the panel here is, what are some resources you would recommend to the members joining us for today's webinar? And I know that in our Q&A, we already had colleagues with us who are asking about some helpful resources. So I'm wondering, Dr. Love, if you have any that you would suggest?
Well, and this is not a shameless plug for NCDA, but since we are doing this webinar for NCDA, I would start first and foremost by saying to take advantage of the resources that NCDA has, especially, again, another shameless plug for the committee that me and Dr. Chen co-chair, the Diversity Initiatives and Inclusion Committee, because that committee, we're doing, I think, amazing work in providing resources to really help career services practitioners and counselors, and, you know, the whole gamut under the career services umbrella, have tools to be able to effectively work with diverse populations. And so one of the things that we have is a multicultural resource list. Anyone, you don't have to be an NCDA member, can access that list from the NCDA website. And then the committee, we do things like webinars like the one today. We have also written articles through a lot of the NCDA journals and the web bulletin to really provide resources. And so literally just tap it into the things that NCDA is doing, especially with the Diversity Initiative and Inclusion Committee, is a great place to start because we really have been fighting the good fight. Dr. Chen can tell you the committee has been working for years to really make the organization more woke, for lack of a better way to put it. And so I think you will see now, even with our global conferences, you will see that's another place to go. You'll see more workshops and more professional development institutes that have a diversity and inclusion feel, flavor, social justice lens. And that's because of the work that we've been doing over the last handful of years to make NCDA as an organization more responsive. So a good place to start is taking advantage, especially for those who are members. You're paying a membership, take advantage of the resources right at your doorstep. And there's other professional organizations out there too that have really great resources to really help with your self-reflection and growth so that you can really be responsive to all of your clients, not just some. So that's one place to start. The other thing, you all work for either a college or you're in private practice or you're working for a nonprofit organization. Looking within your organizations to see what resources they have. And if they don't have the resources they should, maybe call them out in a nice way. Well, you don't have to be nice. I'm not gonna be nice, but call them out and like, hey, why aren't we looking at these things? Why aren't there resources available? Because oftentimes by making a joyful noise loudly, you can get things happening in your own backyard that can be helpful. And I will tell you, for example, at my campus, this is a recent thing, and this came from students advocating for themselves and faculty and staff saying we need to do better as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And so now there is an Office of Inclusive Excellence in Diversity that is now charged to make the campus be accountable for what it says it's going to do, be in a diverse and inclusive environment. And so that's another thing I would say to people to do. Look in your backyard, and if the organization in which you're working in isn't providing or doesn't have a department or office that's doing this work, ask why not.
I'll add that there's a free anti-racism 3-module training course being offered by the Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso. You can pay for CEUs or you can just take the training for free, but it's a really fabulous program, and it is just the 3 modules, and that's a really good place to start doing some of this internal work.
I would also add that, most of our divisions of ACA have multicultural counseling competencies. And then ACA has the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. As professionals, we should be integrating those competencies in our work. I mean, they're there for a reason. And I don't see why. I have been so perturbed at the number of counselors that do not know these competencies exist and aren't using them in their work. And so I am intentional about integrating those competencies in my teaching with my students because I want them to be familiar with them and know how to integrate them into their work. They're part of their assessments, my midterms and my final, my projects, everything that they have to do, they have to center it around these competencies. And so we as professionals need to go back and pull out those competencies and check ourselves. Are we sticking to what these competencies are telling us? And then we need to implement those into our work and integrate them into our work, because, you know, people wrote them for a reason. They're there for a reason.
Yeah, I just have a couple of resources. So the research I did on COVID-19 and its impact on marginalized communities, a lot of that up front in the first question came from some research done by Nita Kantanemi. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, so apologize about that, because I know how that is for myself. But yeah, if you just Google impact of COVID-19 on marginalized populations, you'll find that research, and she's done an extensive amount of research on that. So I want to call that out and give credit where credit is due on that information that I did research on. And then this book, it's called Closing the Opportunity Gap, and it's a great practical guide for practitioners. There's a chapter in it on career development, and utilizing the whole framework of the book talks about using identity conscious techniques in terms of working with students on campus. And so that is about allowing students to reflect on the ways that their race and their identities as students of color impede their abilities sometimes to be successful in the systems and the structures that were not built for them. And so to be able to reflect and talk about those pieces in an identity conscious framework is what that book is centered around. And then each chapter ends with like a checklist of things to help you implement some of the things that it's a combination of contributions from different practitioners across several institutions. So it's a great way to be like, okay, I've read this chapter, now what can I do? Which is a lot of questions, you know, people have. And so it actually gives you kind of a guide at the end of each chapter, which I have found helpful in my approach to my work.
These are excellent resources and tools that we can all certainly take part in. The other piece too, of course, like I certainly, with our audience today, I want us to be mindful too of, in terms of vetting these resources, but making sure like they're applicable, right? Because I think here's the other piece with, I think it was kind of an interesting point, not just interesting, but actually very real, where somebody was saying, like putting a meme on social media saying, you know, it's like, just because somebody's reading a few chapters doesn't mean that they become automatically anti-racist or that they are anti-oppressive in some way. So it's not just going to take just a chapter or two. Like it really is like constantly like immersing yourself in some of these resources, and really, I mean, resources that are probably going to render you vulnerable and uncomfortable sometimes. But I think that's part of the growing process. The other piece is also making sure, especially in collecting these resources, curating resources for clients and students where they're not authored just by people of the dominant group, dominant culture, or privileged groups, right? Because I think here's one of the concerns that I often have. I mean, I appreciate, like, for example, that Dr. Robin DiAngelo wrote a book about white fragility. That is an important text, and I think everybody should be reading that text. But at the same time, like, thinking about who's authoring your text, who's authoring your resources. Because for example, like I think about Brittany Cooper's work, right? Where that could be really powerful, not just for career practitioners, but particularly for Black women. And like think about our clients and students who are Black women. And so think about in that capacity. The other piece
is, she's awesome. Brittany Cooper is like the bomb.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I also wanted to add, especially for anybody who works in schools, consults with schools, who's a school counselor here with us today. Of course, I'm sure you've heard about Dr. Bettina Love's work, but I'm also going to link it here. But the name of the text that has been certainly necessary right now in this kind of racial climate is "We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom." So, and in many ways, you know, Dr. Bettina Love talks about spirit murdering in that text and what that does in terms of spirit murdering, specifically for communities of color and students of color in the educational pipeline. So I know that I was going to say, like, let's close out with some of these questions, but I think I wanted to pitch this question to the panel from the Q&A because this is a really powerful question. How do we combat the racist expectations of the hiring process, including interview expectations? Coaching clients to play the game to get a job can be important, but it also feels wrong to try to get clients to conform to white expectations.
And Christian, with Dr. Chan, I want to nuance that question, because when I do talk about career counseling in my classes, I pose the question when I talk about Black men specifically. I say, what if his name was Raekwon? You know, or what if he has locks? And so we have to remind our students that hiring practices still favor whiteness. A lot of companies still favor whiteness. Why did we need to have a Supreme Court case that says that ethnic folks can wear their hair the way they want to wear their hair? If you do a search for professional hairstyles, white folks' hair will come up. Unprofessional hairstyles, you'll see natural hair and locks. So on the front end, we have to prepare students for what those hiring practices look like. And so if they are in the position to hire other folks, they'll be mindful of the fact that I just can't do like other folks and look at my this person's name and throw their resume out because of what their name is. I can't have policies like what professional hair looks like. Professionalism is still whiteness. They're white standards of Black respectability and brown respectability. And so we have to really be able to unpack what professionalism is and be more culturally inclusive in those practices and what our job requirements are.
And I think we also need to, on the very kind of nitty gritty end of things, we need to come up with ways that we can work with our clients to find workplaces that are more equitable. And you know, that doesn't just include, like, do they have a non-discrimination policy on their website? It actually means support on the other side, because a lot of workplaces are looking to recruit more diverse staff. But if you get in there and you're the only Black lesbian around, you're going to feel weird and uncomfortable and very tokenized, and not have anyone to talk about your experiences with without them, without the risk of people, you know, having those microaggressions against you or minimizing your experience or whatever. And so, among other things, what I encourage my clients to look for and what I work with them on is, does the employer have affiliation groups? And are they working towards ways to make all of their employees feel comfortable and welcome? Are there places that people can go when things happen to them, even if they're small things, especially if they're small things, I think, because the small things add up so much.
Yeah, so it's really helping the clients you're working with to understand that not every opportunity is the right opportunity. There's still so many organizations that have a lot of work to do. And so could you do the job that is opening in that organization? Yes. But the question you want to ask yourself is, do you want to be in that space if that organization hasn't done the work that it needs to do to be a welcoming environment for all? And so then you also have to ask yourself the question, okay, maybe it's not the most welcoming. Do I want to be the one in that organization working from within to kind of change it? So it's really having those honest conversations with the students you're working with, acknowledging what is, and helping them to navigate what they are willing to do at this point in time in their career journey. Someone may say, you know what, I know that organization has some flaws, but I like the opportunity, and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be the change agent from within. And then others were like, I'm tapping out from that. Let's look at some other places that would provide me a little bit more support. So it's being able to work with your clients and having those honest conversations and help them figure out where they're at and what they would be comfortable doing at this point in time in their career journey, and supporting them either way. And Emily, there was a question if you could repeat in the chat room, if you could repeat the name of the place for that anti-racist 3-module.
Oh yeah. Yeah, let me actually put it in the chat here. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's a really fabulous training, and it's free, but I recommend you dedicate some pretty serious time to sitting down because the modules are fairly long. But you know, it's completely worth doing. So I've just typed it in the chat there.
And Dr. Chen, I think we have a good next topic for our committee to take on for another webinar, because I see in the chat room someone is asking that perhaps because there could be a webinar or we could direct someone to a webinar, of course, dealing with trauma-informed counseling practices. And so that might be I don't know if anyone on the panel knows of something that we could direct the folks on the call to, or if not, we can have that be one of the things we work on with our committee for our next webinar. So, because I think in the time we find ourselves in, it would be very well received, and I think very much needed. So.
Mm-hmm. So the funny thing is I do, and we'll be creating that as certainly our next panel that we host from our committee, but particularly around like the linkage between trauma-informed career services and particularly as it relates to equity issues, right? And a member of our committee, Dr. Latoya Haynes-Toby, is actually well-versed in that particular work. So we'll definitely have a panel set up for that. But you know, I'm looking at the time, and I wanted to also highlight, so I'm wondering if each of the panelists, if each of you could give maybe a brief, no more than 60 seconds, closing statement on what are some takeaways that our audience can take away from our conversation today.
Yeah, I'll go. And so I think I learned this in a race equity inclusion training that, you know, this analogy that you see a pond and you see several of the fish floating up on the water and you think, something must be wrong with the fish. And so you keep walking and you see another pond with more fish and they're belly up and you think, what is wrong with the fish? It's not the fish. This is not about fish fixing. This is not about people fixing. I think we need to make sure that we understand that we cannot come from a deficit mindset when it comes to working with our students and our clients. It's about fixing the pond, but really it's about the groundwater that feeds into that pond and causes the toxic environment that our students and our clients and all of us are encountering every day. So it's about fixing the system and not the fish, but we do recognize we do have to provide resources and tools to help them navigate these systems and these structures to make sure that they are fully prepared. So just remember that, you know, it's not about fixing, there's nothing wrong with them, it's the system. And we have to remind ourselves that, you know, race isn't the problem, it's racism. So think about that as you're working with your clients and your students, but that's my takeaway, and I hope that helps all of you as well.
I love it. Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to think of it. And I'll just add that particularly for practitioners who are white or pass as white, just, as I said earlier, step into the discomfort. It's okay. White fragility is something we've talked about a few times here. This is not the time for it. Be uncomfortable. Step into it. Do some of the heavy lifting. Our colleagues of color have been carrying this burden this whole time. We got to pick up our share of the burden, and a society that has systems in place that keep certain groups of people, keep putting barriers in place for certain groups of people, winds up disserving all of us. So it's really time, it's way past time for those of us who have more privilege to really start carrying some of that burden.
And I think I would say that be courageous. And I would say that I hope it doesn't take another African-American being shot in the streets to give you the courage to be courageous. The time is now, and step into being uncomfortable, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and go beyond talk, move into action.
I will say this: be you unapologetically, be you authentically, and let that come through when you work with your clients. Your clients will know that you're being inauthentic. And one of my students said this, and I love it. When you come into a situation with a client who's culturally different from you, come into the situation with the mindset that I don't know shit. And sit down with the client and say, look, I don't know your experience, and help me to understand your experience. And so another thing I would say, look at the work of Dr. Noma Devines in cultural broaching, because that's going to be important too. But the main thing is, and this is at the foundation of our multicultural social justice counseling competencies, is be aware of who you are. Just be who you are. Be authentic. And that's the first part.
So I want to say a huge thank you to our esteemed panelists for sharing your time, your gifts, your talents, your expertise, and your cultural capital with us. This means a lot, not only to our committee, but to the National Career Development Association and to career practitioners at large. And so I wanted to, of course, close out, you know me, you all know me. I close out with quotes, but one I'm going to share from Audre Lorde with us today. And Audre Lorde shares with us, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. So again, thank you all so much. I will go ahead and hand it back off to Alicia with NCDA headquarters.
Woo!
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, all of you. Wonderful webinar. Thank you again. Attendees, don't forget, I will be sending the recording link from the webinar to all of you. It will be probably next week before we get that out. And then the link will also be posted on the NCDA website. So if you enjoyed the webinar or want to share it with more people, feel free. It will be available on the website for anyone to view at all times free of charge. And then if they want the continuing education, they can pay the registration fee for that. So we'll get it posted on the website for everybody to enjoy. And panelists, I did want to ask, would you guys be willing to send me an email with some of the resources that you listed so that I can have those in writing and send to all the attendees in the follow-up email?
Sure.
Sounds
okay.
like.
So attendees will include some of the resources that they will be sending along as well in that email for follow-up. Thank you all for attending today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.